The year was 1994, August in particular, and SNK was gearing up for the release of what was to become one of their most popular franchises of all time. What started out as an all-star fighting tournament between characters from various video games such as Fatal Fury, The Art of Fighting, Ikari Warriors, and Psycho Soldier, as well as newly created characters, turned into one of the greatest and most influential titles in the video games industry. This is the story of the King of Fighters 94. The history of the King of Fighters goes back a few years before the release of the first title. In 1991, SNK released their first fighting game called Fatal Fury. The gameplay follows the typical formula for fighting games at the time, but in addition had a two-lane battle system. This allowed fighters to shift lanes between the foreground and the background. With the release of Fatal Fury being so early within the genre, the player only had the option of selecting between three characters: Terry, Andy, or Joe. Following this, the player then had the option of selecting their first opponent, the rest of which would then follow systematically. The game was a commercial success and paved the way for future releases and new titles within the fighting genre for SNK. In fact, it was only a year later when SNK would release a sequel to the Fatal Fury game, as well as a new franchise that would go on to help them complete the roster for the King of Fighters.
Again, legendary men return. Fatal Fury 2!
In 1992, Fatal Fury 2 was released to critical success and went on to become Japan's second highest grossing arcade game of 1993, just below Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting. Aside from various other accolades, SNK was clearly onto something special. Within the same year, SNK released The Art of Fighting, which originally served as a prequel to the Fatal Fury series, and featured characters Ryo Sakazaki and Robert Garcia. It also introduced a variety of systems that have become staples of the genre, such as desperation moves, the spirit gauge, special pre-battle introductions, and taunts. According to SNK's motion artist, Yoichiro Soida, they wanted to show the characters as big as possible on the screen, and they have accomplished their goal of having some of the biggest and most detailed sprites among the fighting games of that generation. The Art of Fighting was another commercial success for SNK, and this led to them being attached to an idea of a crossover between the two series. The initial prototype version of what was to become the King of Fighters, titled Survivor, was surprisingly a beat-em-up title similar to games like Double Dragon, and would only use the core characters from the Art of Fighting and Fatal Fury series. However, and probably for the best, this idea was scrapped, and due to the success of the aforementioned titles, SNK was still confident in proceeding with the crossover, and they eventually agreed upon, you guessed it, a fighting game. Characters from Ikari Warriors and Psycho Soldier were added to the roster in order to bring some appeal to the older fans of SNK's previous titles, and in order to appeal to the younger crowd, SNK decided to create some new characters, all the while still trying to make them rival the style of the older ones. One character in particular had a lot of time spent on his design. this being Kiyoku Sanagi, the newcomer and the hero who would be going up against the main characters from the other SNK franchises. In fact, so much time was put into his design that his personality and character remained a mystery until the very end of development. Yet through all the effort, he has become the face of the franchise and probably one of the most iconic characters in the genre. The basic gameplay system was to remain similar to Fatal Fury and the Art of Fighting series. Each player also had a power gauge that charged automatically when either blocking or taking attacks, but could also be charged manually by holding down 3 buttons at the same time. Once this power gauge was filled, the character's basic attacks would become stronger for a short period of time, and they would also be able to perform a super move, which consumes the entire power gauge but, if successful, could be a devastating blow to the opponent's health bar. Another feature, albeit taken from Fatal Fury 2, was the ability to use a super move when a character's life gauge was below 75%. All fighting games at the time had the same structure: best of 3 rounds between 2 fighters before moving on to the next opponent. The King of Fighters innovated the genre by bringing in a new system in the form of a 3-on-3 team-based match called the Team Battle system. Instead of selecting a single character, the player would select one of 8 teams, with each team consisting of 3 members. Before each match, the player would then select the order in which their team members would enter the battle. When one character is defeated, the next one would simply take his or her place, while the victor would gain a reward of a small portion of their life restored. If a player was struggling against an opponent, they were also able to call on the assistance of one of their teammates to jump in and perform a support attack. This structure added something new to the genre and was an idea originally formed during the prototype version of the King of Fighters. It has influenced many video games as well. One in particular that comes to mind is the Marvel vs. Capcom series of games. As someone who has spent a lot of time in the arcade as a kid, it was ideal to get the most time out of a game with just 1 coin. There was no other fighting game that would give you the best bang for your buck other than the King of Fighters. Now with the gameplay out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about these teams within the game. As mentioned before, many of the characters were carried over from previous SNK titles, and some of them new and original characters. You had Team Japan, which consisted of Kiyoku Sanagi, Benimaru Nikaido, and Goro Daemon. Team Fatal Fury, consisting of Terry Bogard, his brother Andy, and Joe Higashi. Team Art of Fighting, which had Ryu Sakazaki, Robert Garcia, and Ryu's father Takuma Sakazaki. There is Team Women Fighters, and that is the canonical name, yes, consisting of Mai Shiranui, who brought some excellent physics to the later games, by the way, Yuri Sakazaki, Ryu's younger sister, and King. Next up, we got Team Ikari Warriors, also my personal favorite team, consisting of Ralph Jones, Clark Still, and Hayden. Team Korea Justice, consisting of Kim Kapwan, Chang Kohan, and my personal favorite character, and Choi Bounge, who looks a lot like Freddy Krueger. You got Team Psycho Soldier, which consists of Athena Asamiya, Sai Kenso, and Shingen Sai, and finally, the team that is probably the most forgettable and least played, Team American Sports, consisting of Heavy DJ, Lucky Glauber, and Brian Backer. Although props to SNK for being this creative and adding both a basketball player and an American football player to a fighting game. Finally, we had the main villain, Rugel Bernstein, designed and meant to be the most violent and evil boss character ever. He was an arms dealer that planned to turn all the competitors of the tournament into stone statues as part of his collection of defeated martial artists. To be completely honest, it probably isn't the worst thing that anyone could do, but it doesn't change the fact that he is one of the toughest bosses to beat, at least in my personal opinion. The King of Fighters 94 was a commercial success for SNK, and even though some within SNK had their doubts about it initially, it was quick to prove them wrong, as King of Fighters 94 not only innovated the genre but became a mainstay within it, and seems to be going strong to this day with the recent release of the King of Fighters 15. Aside from the massive roster which was unrivaled at the time, they decided to do something similar, although not entirely so, to the annual sports titles. The King of Fighters initially had a good run of annual releases, but instead of just what I would consider as updates, each new entry had new mechanics, new characters, a fairly new story, and so much more that it still amazes me to this day how they managed to pull it off, something that would clearly be impossible today. All credit to the amazing team over at SNK that brought us these amazing titles, and I'm personally happy that it's still an ongoing series. I would gladly like to talk more about each and every title, but I'll leave that to later videos. This includes one of my favorite characters, Yori Yagami, and also one of my least favorite games, Maximum Impact. But thank you so much for watching this episode of The Gaming Impact. If you enjoy my content and would like to see more videos like this, please hit that subscribe button, and if you feel like hitting that notification bell, please do so. Your support is much appreciated. Cheers, and I'll see you soon.